Good morning, everybody. As we make our way through the 20th century, particularly the middle part of the 20th century, the post-war period and the Cold War period, and as we continue to talk about things like the Vietnam War and the effects that they're having, we want to take some time today through your Farber reading to talk about what was going on in America in the 1960s, particularly this notion of the counterculture. So I want to talk about kind of view this reading through the lenses of two countercultures. And as we talk about it, it might become a little clearer in terms of what I mean by that. So to start off, we want to kind of define the terms. So defining the counterculture movement. One way that the phrase counterculture can be defined is as a way of life and set of attitudes opposed to or at variance with the prevailing social norm. Now, obviously, we can have countercultures in a variety of times in a variety of places. Virtually every culture at any point in history could conceivably have a counterculture. What we're talking about specifically is what this movement, this countercultural movement, looked like in the 1960s in the United States of America. And so, in the 1960s, this term kind of gained traction as a way of describing what was going on, a set of movements whose behaviors, ideas were kind of everywhere, were shaping not just what people were saying in the media, what people were talking about in classrooms, but also shaping the popular culture, shaping what was coming over the radio, shaping what was the clothes that people were wearing, the ways that people were just kind of spending their free time. Um, and at the heart of this uh, was the discourse around the Vietnam War and other controversial issues. For a counterculture to really be a counterculture, it needs to speak against or to engage in a kind of interrogation with some of the prevailing ideas of the culture at the time. And so David Farber, in the reading that you had, I think does a good job highlighting some of the ways that this counterculture took shape. But in the process, as he does that, one of the things that we discover is that the counterculture itself isn't monolithic. We can't really just talk about counterculture as one thing. There are a number of different expressions of it, and in some cases, some of those expressions might even be at odds with one another. And so let's uh, talk a little bit about the way that Farber explores that in the reading that you had for today. So one of the key elements of the counterculture, and one of the ways that Farber unpacks the notion of the counterculture is by looking at the ideas of ideology and activism. As we said, the defining issue of the 1960s counterculture in the United States was opposition to the war in Vietnam. We spent some time earlier this week talking about the run up to that war, talking about some of the causes of that war, and even some of the causes for why the United States got involved. But it was clear by the mid to late 1960s that there was a growing number of people in the United States that who were opposed to that war, opposed to U.S. involvement in that war, and also opposed to all kinds of other issues that orbited the United States involvement in that war. Um, those who chose to protest in a lot of these ways might be termed true believers. They express their opposition to the war in active ways, sometimes costly ways, sometimes ways that came at great personal cost to themselves. Among these groups, one of the ones that Farber highlights is a group called the Diggers. The Diggers lived in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco, which could kind of be seen as the epicenter of the counterculture movement in the sense that at this time in the late 1960s, there were a number of people flocking to that area from really all over the country. But as Farber says, there were a lot of other places. He mentions Lawrence, Kansas. He mentions Chicago. He mentions even places like Fayetteville, Arkansas, to make the point that a lot of college towns, a lot of university towns, were epicenters of the counterculture, as well as just places where people gathered, larger cities. Um, but the diggers who kind of made their home in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood um, are really on the forefront of what we might call this activist wing of the counterculture. they engaged in outreach to their community. They believed that food should be free. They believed that food was a basic human right, and so they did what they could to offer food to those in need. And there were a lot of people in need in that part of the country. That they opened up their homes for people to stay when they needed shelter. And in addition to these sort of acts of benevolence, these acts of charity, they also engaged in a lot of public performances. They would stage street theater. They would play music out in public. They would engage in poetry readings and other performances that were all designed to raise people's awareness, awareness of the causes that the Diggers believed in. And so, for these reasons, Farber calls the Diggers the visionary core of the counterculture. They were always kind of a small group. Um, they did gain some level of fame because of their work, but they took seriously what they were doing. They referred to themselves as life actors. So they would engage in these performances of street theater. They would engage in these public art performances, but they believed that the real performance, the real performance that mattered was the ways that they lived, the ways they lived in community, the ways they lived among their community. They believed they could change the world through small actions that they performed within their small circle of influence. And in terms of what they believed in, central to what they really held dear was a desire to break free from uh, what uh, what Farber calls the money nexus, right? This idea that the materialistic, money-driven set of values that shaped everything. They believed that these values, which they saw, of course, in the lives of their parents and the lives of many in the generation before them, as well as many in their own generation, we're ruining society. And even more than that, that the desire for money, this materialistic mindset was really what was propelling the war machine. Um, that the fact that so many of their generation were getting drafted into the war, going off and dying in Vietnam, could be chalked up to the sort of money hungry ethos that was driving society and government at various levels. Now, along with the ideology, along with the activism, along with the ethical concerns that we see in the counterculture, what most of us are probably familiar with are the cultural expressions of this culture. This more than anything is maybe what gets handed down from generation to generation. It's what we're drawn to when we watch movies about the hippies. It's what we're drawn to when we read about or when we listen to the music of that generation. When we see their fashion, when we see the ways they express themselves. And so it's these cultural expressions, maybe even more so than their activism that drew attention to the message. So if we look at art and literature, um, some of the main influences, sort of proto hippies, sort of the counterculture before the counterculture of the 60s was could be found in the Beat movement, which is a literary movement that emerges in the mid to late 1950s. Artists like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder, among others, were the heart of this movement. And they kind of served as avatars for the post-war generation's restlessness. If we want to kind of think about a a personality trait, that restlessness, that desire to kind of always be kind of looking for more, always be journeying, was key to both the literature of the Beats and to the counterculture. Um, you also have music, right? Genres like jazz and rock and folk provided a template for this new kind of musical expression. We're going to talk more on Monday about some of this music, primarily the folk music, the protest music of the counterculture through artists like Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan, who's pictured here. This is one of my favorite photographs from the counterculture. It's Bob Dylan and Allen Ginsberg at the grave of Jack Kerouac. Um, but in addition to protest music, in addition to folk music, uh, we know a number of other artists I'm sure you're familiar with. We can think about the Grateful Dead and the MC5 and Jefferson Airplane, which were artists that were actively taking part in some of these countercultural happenings. We'll talk more about some of those things on Monday as well, the art happenings, the art performances. But you also had a number of other artists uh, who were influenced by the counterculture. You can chart even the way that that artists like the Beatles were expressing themselves and see that the counterculture and the counterculture of the U.S. in the '60s and the music and the ideas of that culture were really shaping the Beatles expression at the time. So um, you have this rich kind of artistic and literary and musical uh, set of artifacts that's coming out of this counterculture. But maybe even more than the art and music, it was the lifestyles, the practices, the behaviors of the counterculture that captured the general public's attention, and understandably also raised fears about their effects on society. We've already talked a little bit about how some of the behaviors of the diggers and others evidenced a rejection of materialistic culture, the kind of culture that they saw um, playing out in their parents' generation. Um, we're not gonna we're not gonna pursue the same things with the same um, enthusiasm that our parents have, and so the sort of idea of dropping out of that materialistic mindset that they saw driving so much in society. That's a key part, a key practice, a key attitude of the counterculture. But then there were other things, right? Chief among the concerns that the larger culture and their parents had about the counterculture was the embrace of illegal drugs and the rejection of conventional standards in sexual relationships. Now, obviously, drugs were nothing new, nor was sex outside of marriage. But during this period in the 1960s, these two things became sort of central to the identity of so many in the counterculture. So whereas Farber talks a lot about this, whereas a number of these young people's parents might have engaged in the abuse of prescription drugs, certainly had nicotine and alcohol addictions. It was experimentation with marijuana and maybe even more distinctively LSD that shaped the counterculture's approach to drugs. And as Farber talks about the ways that this counterculture viewed drugs almost as not even just as a rite of passage, almost as a sacrament of the movement, um, not only caused a lot of people to sort of bind their identity up in that drug use, but also, again, caused a lot of the larger culture's concerns about what was going on in the counterculture. The same with sex, right? The 1960s in the United States was not the first time that people had engaged in sex outside of marriage, but there was this sort of generational embrace where maybe just a few years before, the majority of people would have said that sex outside of marriage was immoral or was not a good idea. The notion of free love, the notion of just much more um, uh, illicit sexual activity, much more libertine sexual activity, I guess I should say, becomes a kind of a defining factor of the counterculture at this time. So it's not just about ideology. It's not just about fighting the war. In many cases, it's about a lifestyle. It's about being kind of given the permission to embrace these things that um, before had maybe been seen as off limits or seen as illicit or seen as taboo. And this was exciting for a lot of people in the counterculture. And as you might imagine, over time, it was these sorts of behaviors, these sorts of attitudes that often eclipsed that visionary core that Farber talks about. That becomes these things become the defining traits of the counterculture beyond even the activism. And so, as the 1960s draw to a close, it becomes evident that while you did have the true believers, you had the people who were speaking out against the war, you had the people who were speaking out for civil rights, you had the people who were engaged in acts of mercy and acts of uplift for those in need. A number of people were drawn to the counterculture simply because they wanted an excuse to get away from their parents. They wanted an excuse to try something exciting. They wanted an excuse to consume the excesses associated with the movement. and in particular to participate in drug use, to participate in sex with the spirit of abandon. So one of the documentarians, a photographer named Larry Keenan, one of the documentarians of this counterculture movement, he one of the pictures he published is this one with all the photographs. It's a police board in San Francisco, and it's all the runaways. Um, young people, usually white middle class kids from all over the country, would run away from home and come to Haight-Ashbury, and their parents would be looking for them. And in a lot of cases, these kids would just get kind of swallowed up by the culture. And there were a lot of people out there looking to exploit those who were pursuing this kind of abandon. Among them, this guy here next to the photo board, Charles Manson. As the 1960s comes to a close, the story of Charles Manson and the Manson family murders becomes sort of a sad footnote to this second counterculture, right? The more consumptive counterculture, the counterculture that was not necessarily about the ideology, it was not necessarily about the activism, but more about the consumption of what the counterculture offered. The Manson family becomes again a sad and terrifying footnote to that. Um, as does the photo on the bottom here of the Rolling Stones concert at Altamont. Um, Altamont was sort of the West Coast answer, or was meant to be the West Coast answer to Woodstock. Um, they hired Hell's Angels, a motorcycle gang, to be the security guards, and things turned ugly. And a young black man was killed by the Hell's Angels. They beat him during the Rolling Stones performance, and so Altamont also becomes a kind of sad footnote uh, to what was going on in the 60s and the way that this culture was kind of taking a darker turn. And a lot of this just had to do with people seeing the fallout of this consumeristic approach, the disillusionment that comes when they're longing for freedoms, but then those freedoms don't turn out to be as liberating as anticipated. It turns out using drugs and pursuing sex with reckless abandon maybe doesn't sustain life in the way that people had hoped it would. And so that sort of sunny aspect of the counterculture begins to turn darker as the 60s draw to a close. And there are a number of people who have chronicled this, of course. I already mentioned Larry Keenan, the photographer. There's essayists. Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion are both essayists. I think they're both mentioned in the Farber reading, who talk about some of the ways that the fashion, the music, and even the ideas of the 1960s were treated more like consumer objects. And this isn't surprising, right? We are a consumeristic culture. The kids who were pursuing the counterculture were raised in that same consumeristic culture that has sort of shaped things in the United States and really shaped things in the West for generations now. And so it's not surprising that the ideas of the 60s, the fashions of the 60s, the practices of the 60s would become more about consumption than anything else. Um, and so while you still have the true believers as a widespread phenomenon, you have people kind of pursuing these things as tourists or pursuing these things for the excitement they can get out of them. And so Tom Wolfe's book, Radical Chic and Mau Mauing the Flat Catchers was a a key book in this kind of in this genre of chronicling what was going on among the counterculture. He also wrote a book called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is sort of a really important work of that movement. It's where he describes Ken Casey and his band of merry pranksters as they are kind of establishing a countercultural community uh, centered on the use of LSD and centered on some of these expressions. Um, and staging events with the Grateful Dead and other artists. So both of these books are really great chronicles of kind of what was going on in the 60s. Joan Didion is uh, another essayist. Her book, The White Album, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, is the one that's mentioned in Farber's reading. And they do a good job of sort of narrating some of these events and some of these um, some of these shifts in the culture in the 1960s. Uh, but what we see is that by the end of the decade, um, there was still a need for advocacy and justice. There were still people speaking out against the war. There were still people speaking out for civil rights, and many of these people were connected to the counterculture. So I don't want to minimize that, and we'll continue to talk about that. But there were also many who had participated in the counterculture who were burnt out. They were spiritually hungry for something of substance. They were looking for something deeper than what a lot of the countercultural expressions they'd engaged in had provided, and that in a large part continues to be an important part of the story in the later part of the 20th century. So um, we'll continue to uh, be talking about some of these things. On Monday, we're going to talk particularly about the art and music that's kind of emerging out of this counterculture. And I hope that this just brief discussion of the Farber reading has done a little bit of work to set up that discussion. Have a good weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.